Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Zoom-based webinar. My name is Professor Anne Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to our second joint event held in partnership with the Armenian Film Foundation. This webinar will focus on a new exhibit from the Armenian Image Archive with presentations on the subject of Stations of the Cross on the Via Dolorosa, 1875 to 2022, a photographic and archaeological journey. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Carla Karapetyan as my partner in this event, as well as our speakers, Dr. Joseph Malikian, Mr. Jack Persekian, and Professor Shimon Gibson, to provide presentations on the 14 Stations of the Cross along the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, highlighting photographs from the Bonfils Studio in 1875, as well as new images taken by Mr. Persekian and a discussion by Professor Gibson on the archaeological evidence regarding the presumed burial site of Jesus of Nazareth at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For today's webinar, I am grateful to note the co-sponsorship of our event by the UCLA Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, the UCLA Narakatsi Chair in Armenian Studies, the UCLA Library, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR, and the Ararat Eskidjan Museum. And on behalf of the co-sponsors here at UCLA, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tongva peoples. My colleague and friend, Dr. Carla Karapetyan, will provide a formal introduction for our speakers in a moment. But let me note that for those of you watching live via the Zoom webinar platform, you have an opportunity to send questions to us by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom portion of your screen and typing in your question. Please be sure to be as specific and succinct as possible in your questions, and we will direct as many of the questions as are practical to our speakers when they are finished. We anticipate that the webinar itself will take around 45 to 50 minutes, after which we will begin the Q&A portion of the event. Also, please note that this event is being recorded for future viewing at our Promise Armenian Institute website and YouTube channel. And in the unlikely event that this Zoom webinar drops for any reason, please just connect right back to the same link, as it will put you back into our Zoom session. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn the webinar over to the well-known filmmaker, director, writer, and broadcaster, Dr. Carla Karapetyan. Dr. Karapetyan earned her undergraduate and PhD degrees in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science before working as a producer, director, and foreign correspondent based in Britain. For a number of years, she was an anchor for the BBC World News, after which she directed Dying for the President about Chechnya, Lifting the Veil about women in Afghanistan, and Iran Undercover for PBS Frontline World. Her award-winning 2006 feature film, Screamers, depicts genocides of the past century with a focus on the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923. Dr. Karapetyan is the recipient of numerous recognitions, including the Armen T. Wegner Humanitarian Award and the Clara Barton Medal from the National Academy of Sciences Armenian Genocide Museum Institute. She has worked for many years with the Armenian Film Foundation, one of the preeminent centers for visual images of Armenian history and culture. And the Armenian Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA is very proud to partner with this impactful organization in this event. So Carla, I will now turn the webinar over to you for an introduction of our speakers.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I appreciate it. The Armenian Image Archive is the first of new collaborations between the Promise Armenian Institute and the Armenian Film Foundation. We have three goals: preservation, research and exhibit of Armenian photographers and photography related to Armenian subject matter. Now, the Via Dolorosa exhibit can now be viewed on our website, armenianimage.org. It is the first in our past present series, that is, photographic exhibits contrasting photography collections from the late 19th century and early 20th century with contemporary photography of the same locations. The next exhibit will be the ruins of Ani, and the third in the past present series will feature Baalbek in Lebanon. As we will see in today's presentation from Jack Persekian, we want to bring in contemporary photographers to, in some ways, highlight and open a discussion about photography from the past. I'd now like to give short introductions to all three of our participants so that we can move from one to the other as seamlessly as possible. First off will be Dr. Joseph Malikian. He'll be starting with a presentation of the Bonfils Studio photos of the Via Dolorosa from 1875. He's the curator of the Armenian Image Archive and founder of the Malikian collection. He's the author of The Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, an anthology and photo history, and the upcoming book, The Krikorians on Jaffa Road, Architects of Armenian Photography in Jerusalem. Dr. Malikian has gathered many vintage images, and he knows a lot about the history of many Armenian photographic studios dating from the 1860s. Dr. Malikian is joining us from New York State. Our second contributor will be Jack Persekian. Over a century after the Bonfils Studio documented the 14 Stations of the Cross, the artist and photographer Jack Persekian embarked on a project in 2022 to retrace and visually record the cobblestone-lined route on the Via Dolorosa and the symbolic tomb of Jesus of Nazareth within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Jack is currently the founder and director of Al-Mahmal Foundation for Contemporary Art and Gallery Anadiel in Jerusalem. Previously, he held the position of director and head curator of the Palestinian Museum. He was the director of the Sharjah Art Foundation, artistic director of the Sharjah Biennial, head curator of the Sharjah Biennial, founder and artistic director of the Jerusalem Show, and Kalandia International. Jack lives in Jerusalem, but he's joining us today from Los Angeles. And our third contributor is Professor Shimon Gibson, who was appointed in 2017 as Professor of Practice in the History Department at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Dr. Gibson is a British-born archaeologist who has been working in the Holy Land for the past 40 years. During the past 20 years, he has conducted numerous archaeological excavation projects and field surveys in different parts of Israel, Palestine, including the southern desert region. He has extensively studied possible locations for Jesus's tomb, including what is considered to be the traditional location in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He will tell us about his research. And if you haven't seen his book is, he has a number of books, but the one that I read and which got me interested in bringing him into this discussion was The Final Days of Jesus, the Archaeological Evidence, that was published in 2009 by Harper One in the States. It's now been translated into 9 languages. It's a fascinating read. And he recently co-edited the Archaeology and History of the Church of the Redeemer and the Muristan in Jerusalem. He's joining us from Jerusalem. So thank you, all three of you, and thank you again to our sponsors all of our sponsors in their own ways support Armenian photography, and we thank them for supporting this event. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Joseph Malikian.
You need to unmute.
Thank you, Carla, and to all the sponsors of this webinar. Today, as Carla just mentioned, I will be presenting on one of 3 projects which have been underway at the Armenian Image Archive. These projects highlight the photographs of ancient ruins, such as the Stations of the Cross in the Old City of Jerusalem, which is the focus of today's webinar, the ruins of Ani in Turkey and the Roman ruins of Baalbek in Lebanon. All three projects are a study of major sites of cultural heritage, visually chronicled by Armenian and non-Armenian photographers. So I'd like to share my screen. Okay, through the lens of two photographers, Felix Bonfils and Jack Persekian, the current project is a comparative study of past and present images, Stations of the Cross. As we often see, the photographic medium is a very powerful tool which records changes that have occurred with our symbols of cultural heritage. In some instances, these transformations are a result of war, possibly earthquakes, fires, and other destructive forces, or in some instances, they are a function of modernity. In the case of the Stations of the Cross in Jerusalem, photographs can reveal some of the positive and negative changes which have occurred at this revered site that continues to have profound spiritual meaning for the faithful. With respect to the early history of photography, it was at the meeting of the French Academy of Sciences on January 7, 1839, that the world was introduced to the first and most advanced commercial photographic process known as the Daguerreotype. With this invention, photography became a fast-growing technological tool, especially with the collodion photographic process, which could produce multiple images from one negative. With this major development, European photographers the importance of documenting.
This is a conference, Jack داخل فيهم.
I'm sorry. With this major development, European photographers identified the importance of documenting images of the Middle East for scientific and commercial purposes. So many of these photographers converged in Palestine to capture its archaeological sites, biblical scenes, breathtaking landscapes, monuments, and cultural artifacts. One of the photographers who traveled to the Middle East around the 1860s, who eventually relocated and established a renowned photographic studio in Beirut, Lebanon, was Felix Bonfils. Shortly, I will present in greater depth aspects of his remarkable professional accomplishments and his extraordinary photographic output. In 2018, I went to Jerusalem to work on my research devoted to the early history of Armenian photography. It has been firmly established that the Armenians, since the 1850s, dominated the photographic medium in major cities of the Middle East, such as Jerusalem. My time in Jerusalem was focused on very specific objectives, one of which was to gather more history on the first and most famous commercial photographic studio in Jerusalem, established in 1885 by the Armenian photographer Daguerreotype Krikorian. In particular, I wanted to locate the actual site of the Krikorian studio on Jaffa Road. Jaffa Road had been a major thoroughfare, and it was the oldest and longest road that crossed Jerusalem from east to west. It was once a vibrant, bustling commercial district in Jerusalem before 1948. To facilitate my research on the history of Jaffa Road, I was working with two important vintage images taken around the early 1870s by Felix Bonfils. So here we see one of the two Bonfils images that shows the last portion of Jaffa Road as one nears the Jaffa Gate. And you can see it was a commercial center with stores on either side. And in this image, we see a closer view of Jaffa Gate, which is one of the 7 main gates going into the walled Old City in Jerusalem. While the Bonfils images were beautifully composed, revealing, and informative, I needed to probe deeper to locate other images of Jaffa Road as they related to the Krikorian studio. One of the earliest images of Jaffa Road and of the Krikorian studio was taken by the Greek-Egyptian photographer Zankaki. Here we see the Krikorian studio in its early years, around 1885, when Daguerreotype Krikorian opened his studio. Fast forward to early 1900s, we see Jaffa Road as more developed. The Krikorian studio by this time was well established, and it had achieved quite a bit of success. Krikorian had expanded his studio in 1892 on the Krikorian family compound, which you can see on the left. And as we study this image, we see that there was growing competition by other photographers practicing on Jaffa Road, such as Savidis and Khalil Rad. In essence, there was quite a bit of activity in this area. Again, we will fast forward some 30 years, bringing us to the period of the British administrative mandate for Palestine, which started around 1917 and coincided with the fall of the Ottoman Empire following World War I. At this time, the Krikorian studio was run by Gadabet's son, Johannes. In this image, we see the digging of sewage canals on Jaffa Road in 1936, which was part of the British modernization plan for Jerusalem. So moving forward, we see some more images of modern Jaffa Road. This was taken in 1940, and you can see the Krikorian studio on the left. 1942, where there was a snowball fight just across the street from the studio. And 1943, this photo was taken by a British soldier who was stationed in Jerusalem. The story of Jaffa Road comes to an abrupt and tragic end during the war between the Arabs and the Jews in 1948-49. As you can see, there was massive destruction of the area, and sadly, after 63 years, the Krikorian studio was seriously demolished and was forced to close its doors. After the war, Jaffa Road became part of no man's land for 20 years until the Six-Day War in 1967, when it fell under Israeli occupation. When I arrived in Jerusalem in 2018, this is what I discovered. Jaffa Road had been transformed and completely unrecognizable from the images that I was working with. The red arrow marks the location of where the Krikorian studio once stood. And here we have another recent image from a different angle of Jaffa Road, which, as you can see, is now a promenade parallel to the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway. So I have presented images of Jaffa Road as an example of how the camera's lens can help us to assess the transformation of a place which once had a long and rich history. In the case of Jaffa Road, we have a transformation due to war. However, change can be less dramatic, and it can be a function of other factors such as modernity. While European Western tourists were the largest or the target audience for the sale of the Bonfils Photographic photographs, mementos, such as the two images of Jaffa Road just shown, according to Adrian Bonfils, the son of Felix Bonfils, their images were also produced to capture what they imagined was a timeless, unchanging Middle East under disruption by external imported modernity. Adrian Bonfils recognized the negative impact of industrialization or modernity on the physical and social landscape of the Middle East. His words in 1898 set forth, as noted by Gavin Charney, a sense of urgency, outrage, and professional obligation to document for posterity a visual record of the transforming landscape of the Middle East. Adrian Bonfils' words were quite compelling and rather passionate. He seemed to be reframing the meaning and significance of their photographs, which were primarily produced for commercial purposes. He was assigning documentary value to the Bonfils images. More specifically, he noted in one of his journals, his memoirs, in this country of steam and electricity, everything is being transformed, even places. Already in the ancient plain of Sharon is heard the whistle of the locomotive. The immortal road to Damascus, which witnessed the conversion of the Apostle Paul, has become no more than a vulgar railway. The moment is probably not far off when the Holy Mount of Olives and Tabor will each possess its funicular like Mount Rigi outside Lucerne. Before that happens, before progress has completed its destructive course, work before this present, which is still the past, has disappeared forever, we have tried, so to speak, to fix and immobilize it in series of photographic views. At this point, I'd like to present the Bonfils Studio. The studio has an impressive history. After partaking in the French expedition in Lebanon in 1860, Felix Bonfils, a Frenchman, returned to Beirut with his family in 1864, where he eventually opened a photographic studio called Maison Bonfils. As one of the first commercial European photographers to settle in the Middle East, Bonfils produced one of the largest photographic archives documenting Middle Eastern cities, ancient sites, monuments, and its indigenous people classified as ethnographic types. These images were largely intended for consumption by the growing tourist market. Today, they constitute a treasure trove of documentary Middle Eastern photography. Around the early 1870s, Bonfils reported that his commercial studio had produced 591 negatives from various sites around the Eastern Mediterranean, mostly of Jerusalem, but also views of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Greece. These negatives produced 150,000 individual prints and 9,000 stereoscopic views. Since we've established that the indigenous Armenian community dominated the photographic industry and established many of the native studios throughout Jerusalem and the Middle East, we can certainly assume that they were greatly influenced by European photographers who spent time in the Middle East, such as Bonfils. Interestingly, around 1915, Abraham Geragosian, who had apprenticed under Garabek Krikorian, assumed the operations of the Bonfils studio in Beirut until the 1930s when he closed the studio. I want to briefly share some of the images produced by Bonfils, which will give you an idea of the scope of his photographic output and his impressive compositions, which illuminate the history of Palestine during the 19th century. As I've mentioned, the tourist market was Bonfils' target audience. In this image by Bonfils on the left, we see the area just inside of the old city, past Jaffa Gate. We see a number of stores which sold photographs, and in particular, we see a store that advertised the sale of photographs by Bonfils. As Bonfils traveled throughout Palestine, he captured many of its beautiful landscapes and historic places, which we can see here, such as the Mount of Tabor, in the Jezreel Valley, Nablus, Lida, Haifa, Hebron, Jordan River, Bethany, again, Bethlehem, with the pilgrims entering at Christmas time, and we see Jaffa Road as well. Bonfils focused on many different sites in and around Jerusalem, such as Jeremiah's Cave, the Pool of Hezekiah, Rock of the Apostles, Tower of David, the Valley of Gehenna, Valley of the Tombs of Josaphat, Tombs of the Kings, Pool of Siloam, Mount of Olives, and many, many others. Bonfils photographed the major gates leading into the old city, such as Golden Gate, David's Gate, Lion's Gate, Damascus Gate. With Jerusalem and its surrounding areas being a revered religious place, Bonfils photographed many of its religious rituals, such as the washing of the feet on Holy Thursday, just outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and Jews at the Wailing Wall. And he photographed many of Jerusalem's mosques and churches, such as the Russian Church on the Mount of Olives, St. Anne, the Mosque of Omar on the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque as well, and parts of the Armenian sanctuary at St. James. As we see here, Bonfils captured images of people from different parts of Palestine, whether it was Nazareth, Bethlehem, and the people he photographed were the Bedouins, the Sheikhs, and many of the religious figures, such as the Armenian Patriarch and the Greek Patriarch. And here we see some of the vendors and merchants on the streets of Jerusalem and in other Palestinian communities, which contributed to a more comprehensive visual ethnographic record of Palestine. Since the Bonfils images became so prominent in the European capitals, a German company invented around 1900 a mechanical process of colorizing many of Bonfils' images. This was certainly an interesting development in photographic processing, making the Bonfils images that much more marketable. Sometime between 1870 and 1875, Felix Bonfils and his associates embarked on a major photographic project to document the processional path that Christ took to the crucifixion on the Via Dolorosa, which, by the way, is the Latin word for sorrowful way. For centuries, it had been a biblical route which has been sacred to Christians during their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The current exhibit incorporates past and present images of the 14 stations of the cross. With respect to the present images, approximately 150 years after the Bonfils studio documented the stations of the cross, the artist and photographer Jack Persekian embarked on a project this past year and during the early part of the pandemic, to retrace and visually record the cobblestone-lined route on the Via Dolorosa. This also included the symbolic tomb of Christ at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Perseikin's images stand in contrast to the photographs produced by the Bonfils some 36 years after the inception of photography in 1839. In essence, Perseikin's images were produced to assess the changes brought about by modernity. So historically, dating back to the Byzantine period and during the ages that followed, there have been modifications in the direction of the Via Dolorosa, which was traveled by Christ in the Bible. Under Franciscan custody of the Holy Land in the 14th century, a number of events during Christ's crucifixion on the Via Dolorosa were firmly established in Holy Scripture and on the physical site in Jerusalem. As you can see here on the map of the Old City, a map which was produced by the American colony in Jerusalem around 1890, this winding path of 2,000 feet long, the Via Dolorosa in the Old City of Jerusalem, which you can see in blue, starts near the location of the former Antonia fortress where Christ was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate. This symbolic pathway ends in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which houses the traditional site of Calvary where Christ died on the cross and the tomb in which he was laid to rest. Just to say a little bit about this map. Again, it's the Old City, and you've got the walls surrounding it. Here you have Jaffa Gate, which I mentioned earlier, and it's got 4 quarters. You've got the Armenian Quarter here, you have the Christian Quarter here, the Muslim Quarter, and the Jewish Quarter down here. And this is the leading to the church. And on the side here, you have the Garden of Gethsemane. For Christians, the Garden of Gethsemane, which, as you can see at the foot of the Mount of Olives, just outside the Old City, is regarded as sacred ground, which the Bonfils Studio photographed during their documentation of the 14 Stations of the Cross. According to the 4 canonical Gospels, the Garden of Gethsemane, with its small olive grove, symbolizes the location where Christ engaged in sorrowful prayer after the Last Supper on Good Friday. Often referred to as agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, it is at this site where Christ was arrested the night before his crucifixion. We start the Via Dolorosa with Antonia's fortress, which was once a citadel built by Herod the Great and named for his patron, Mark Antony. Actually, this is the site of the first station, and here you see past and present, which is currently the courtyard of the school. At this station, Christ was condemned to die by Pontius Pilate at the Praetorium, or the court, and it is here where Christ received his crown of thorns. With thorns atop his head, Christ was made to bear his cross at the second station, which currently houses 2 Franciscan chapels, the Chapel of Flagellation and the Chapel of Taking Up of the Cross. Between the second and third station is the famous Esse Homo arch, where Pontius Pilate spoke the word Esse Homo, or behold the man, as he exposed Christ to the crowd of onlookers. As these images will show, many sections of the Via Dolorosa have become commercial sites for vendors of different merchandise, as well as eateries. I guess we can only imagine what Adrian Bonfils would have thought about the commercialization of this area. But at this third station, Christ fell for the first time under the weight of the cross. Since 1856, the third station has been the site of the Armenian Catholic Patriarchate, which is called the Polish Chapel, since it was renovated with the financial help of the Polish Army in 1940. At this fourth station, Christ met his mother, Mary. Since 1881, this station has been in front of the Armenian Church of Our Lady of the Spasm. When digging the foundations for the church, a great mosaic dating to the 7th century was found, which probably belonged to the Church of St. Sophia or the Holy Wisdom. The fifth station, so again, with Christ's pitiful condition, along with the weight of the cross which he was carrying, made it difficult for him to move along. At this fifth station, Roman soldiers ordered Simon of Cyrene to help Christ carry the cross. There are some theories that Cyrene was one of Christ's disciples, or possibly that he was one of the pilgrims who had come to Jerusalem in observance of Passover. The sixth station is dedicated to a woman who wanted to ease Christ's pain by wiping her veil, the blood and sweat on his face. The veil was imprinted with the image of Christ's face, thereby creating the veil of Veronica. And again, you can see past and present, and there's some shops on the right side in Jack's photographs. The seventh station commemorates the second time Christ fell under the weight of the cross. He collapsed while crossing one of the gates of Jerusalem leading out to the country. This place is called the Gate of Judgment. This station is marked by a large Roman column placed in the Franciscan chapel. The eighth station is where Christ met the women of Jerusalem who mourned over his destiny. Christ turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." This station is adjacent to the Greek Orthodox monastery of Saint Charalampus. The ninth station represents where Christ fell for the third time. It marks the end of the Via Dolorosa, and it leads one to the entrance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the remaining stations are found. At this site, one can find the Coptic Church of St. Helen. Before going into the church for the remaining stations of the cross, here are some past and present exterior views of the church taken by Bonfils and by Jack. Briefly, the church was initially built and consecrated in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine after his mother, St. Helena, had presumably discovered the site of Calvary in the tomb. And it's over the site that Constantine decided to build the church. Over the century, it has undergone many, many changes due to wars, fires, and other destructive forces. It was last built in the 1880s. So here are some images of the outside of the church. Here's the stairway leading to the church on the side. Here is a facade of the church. We see the front doors leading into the church, and the one side has been closed for many, many years. At one point in time, there were guards who stood outside of the church. At present, that's not the case. So, located in the small Franciscan chapel, the 10th station is where Christ was stripped of his garments. Near the 10th station and in the area of the altar of the Latin chapel is the 11th station where Christ was nailed to the cross. In 1938, this area was decorated with mosaics and paintings depicting the scene of the crucifixion. So here we see significant renovation of this station. The Greek chapel marks the 12th station. Under the altar, there's a silver plate with a hole in the middle, which shows the spot where the cross stood. Bonfils combines the 12th and 13th station, but in actuality, it is at a separate location just past the front entrance into the church. And here we see an image by Jack of this site. And it is here where Christ's body was anointed before burial. The 14th and last station, which is situated at the center of the rotunda of the church on the ground floor, which houses the tomb of Christ. And on the top, you see images by Bonfils of this entire structure. And more recently by Jack, and the church did undergo quite a bit of renovation for a number of years. But what you see the first chamber, which is the chamber of the angel, or the little house, which you can see on the top right by Bonfils and the bottom right by Jack. And this leads to the inner chamber, which is the tomb chamber. And this is the inside, which is a very small area. This is the actual tomb. So this completes the 14 stations of the cross. However, before ending, there's one image Bonfils took of the chapel of St. Helena, which is located in the lower level of the church. For Armenians, this site has special meaning. The chapel, which the Armenians call the Chapel of St. Gregory the Illuminator, is a 12th century Armenian church. Gregory the Illuminator is regarded as the patron saint and the first official head of the Armenian Apostolic Church. He converted the nation of Armenia from paganism to Christianity in the year 301. We can see that this chapel has undergone some renovations since Bonfils' image in the 1870s. Actually, it was renovated in sometime between 2017 and 2019, And it looks like it went through quite a bit of renovations. We can see new railing, a new altar, and marble floors. So I should also note that the Armenian Apostolic Church in Jerusalem shares guardianship of the entire Church of the Holy Sepulchre, along with the Greek Orthodox and the Latin or Roman Catholic churches. So before concluding, I will leave you with a quote by David Lowe, which highlights our attempt at the Armenian Image Archive to understand and reflect on the past by way of photography. David Lowe noted, "Through photographs, we dream of a lost world and commune with what once was." Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor. I think Joe had covered quite a bit, but maybe what I would like to do is maybe go back and show you where this whole project started and how. I'm gonna share my screen. If you give me a second. I hope that's okay. So I've always been very interested and passionate about old photographs. And so this photograph was with my father. My father was a bookbinder, and we lived in the Newgate area. Actually, I was born and raised in the Newgate area. And this photograph of 1933 shows this commotion, confrontation between the Palestinians at the time, protesting to the increased influx of Jewish migration into Palestine at the time, and this confrontation was with the British police. And that's how we usually look at these photographs. I mean, we look at the events and things that happen, and we're very focused on what these photographs revealed in terms of historical events and incidents. But to me, living there and knowing the place quite well, it was quite perplexing how these two buildings on the right and on the left have somehow disappeared. So if we look at the 2016 photograph that I took of that place, you see these two buildings having gone completely. And so if we look at the building on the right, especially the building on the right, we see that it was in pretty good condition at the time. This photograph of the Sisters of Mary Reparatrice, and that's the order that occupied this building, and it was building the same time that the hospital St. Louis on the left-hand side of this photograph. So this photograph from the 30s shows a very decent, quite well-built building that kind of somehow disappeared for I mean, no apparent reason, but the sheer fact that somebody wanted this place cleaned or cleared from this building. This is a photograph from 1950s. So this is a photograph in the period where that whole area, as Joe had mentioned, became a no man's land. And you can see here on the left, the wall that separated West Jerusalem from East Jerusalem between the years 1948 and 1967. But in this photograph, we see part of this wall removed and part of the building of the Sœurs Réparatrices still there, part of it destroyed. And we know from 1948 war that this part was actually intentionally destroyed by the Jordanian army to block the road that gave access from West Jerusalem to East Jerusalem. So to block the Israeli army from advancing. This is a photograph that was taken right after the war of 1967 of that same junction. And we still see the building quite, partly, still standing up, partly destroyed on the right side and partly on the left side of the building, on the east side of the building. And again, that was due to the, for the purpose of blocking that main road access between East and West Jerusalem. But yet somebody wanted, as I said, that whole space cleared out of any buildings in order to distance, and how I saw it, to distance the old city and its wall, first to make the wall visible and then distance it from whatever happens around it. And when I looked at the first plan that was ever, first modern plan of the city that was ever made by William McLean on the behest of General Allenby in 1918, you could see that in the, if you can read here, but what it says that this is the boundary of the old city, as you can see here, and there is this brown line that was drawn, and it said anything within the area of this line and the wall of the city is an area where no one can build anything, and anything that is existing should, or it's preferably that it is removed. And then there is this other dotted line that you can see here, which is actually primarily covering the east side of Jerusalem, where it says any construction can happen with the special permission of the governor, and no development can take place on this east side of Jerusalem. While the west side of Jerusalem, it says on this plan, where all the new developments and industrialization or whatever can happen. We'll get to that later. Just a point of, kind of putting this in the context of where the project, how the project started. I was commissioned by the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research in 2016 to do a project in their garden, and it was like a carte blanche invitation. And so, inspired by the idea of archaeology, I wanted to use photograph as archaeological tools. So, and kind of working as just like archaeologists work, I wanted to create layers. So I've created this kind of light box, or with reference to what was called in the early 20th century, the wonder box, and put the new photograph on the top here on the slit that opens and closes, and the old photographs on the bottom, which would allow people to basically look at the two images juxtaposed or look at them separately. And also giving this kind of almost 3D effect to this presentation. And hence these photographs needed to be quite close, i.e. the angle, the framing, even the type of lens, which was a very, very difficult undertaking. So going back to these old photographs, and maybe kind of referring to what Joe had mentioned earlier, this is a photograph from the from December 11th, 1917, which is the day Allenby entered Jerusalem. And actually you can see him here riding on this horse right here. And you can see all this row of buildings on both sides where, as Joe mentioned, the Gregorian studio, Savides, Rad, and all the rest of the photographers. And this was actually right outside the gate, actually very, very close, few meters outside the gate. And you can see here on the right-hand side, the gate, the wall on the right-hand side of the gate, if you're actually facing the Jaffa gate. But this space, this location, if we look at it today, this is what you see. And so there is this major road, almost a freeway, that goes around the city on the west and northern side of the old city, and again disconnects it from the old city. This other photograph from the American Colony collection shows what I mean, the kind of connection that all this construction outside the walls and how it was linked to the old city, and the wall was actually actually connected to it, and a sort of continuation of life, a continuation of business. Actually, it is when the old city started seeing some development, people started gradually building and opening businesses right outside the gates of the city. So on this side, on Jaffa Gate, on the other side, on the Damascus Gate. And so it was a kind of natural growth and natural development. But that didn't, I think, gel well with the vision of the first planners, or I would say the first occupiers of the 20th century of Jerusalem, the British. So with this photograph, you can see what the situation is like when you juxtapose the old and the new. This is a photograph before 1898, and we know that because you can see here part of the wall that was actually part of the city wall that was dismantled for the grand visit of Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1898. And the big opening that was created in the city wall. But if you look at this juxtaposition, you can see like there's this bridge today that leads to the old city, and it's all propped up on these columns. And to me, it looks like these castles or old city with the, you know, what I call it, the Drogate, and that keeps it frozen in time and very much connected to the biblical Jerusalem that they wanted to see. As Job mentioned in this last phrase, I forgot who the quote was from, but he mentioned the word, the lost world. We wanted to regain the lost world. We wanted to connect to the biblical Jerusalem. And so that was the whole intention behind this, is to kind of create that linkage with the past and hence underline what the colonial government wanted, but also what the Zionists wanted. And that became very clear when I studied these plans. We talked about McLean, but of course it becomes quite clear when we look at Giddis's second plan of Jerusalem. And we see here what was called a development of the first plan, where we were all the planning for West Jerusalem was somehow streamlined and was more in line with the contours of the city and with the topography of city, but yet at the same time you see this shaded light brown area. It's again where it's East Jerusalem, and where Geddes say This is an area where no construction can happen, nothing, no development can take place. So in short, is like the east side of Jerusalem and all around the old city, it should remain very much embedded in that history, in that biblical Jerusalem, and as close as possible to that 2,000-year-old history. But West Jerusalem can, become modernized, and where businesses can open, factories, and etc. But what was very interesting when reading Giddis's papers, it wasn't like Giddis was invited by the British government to come and plan the city. He was actually invited to come to the city by the Zionist Federation to plan the Hebrew University, which is in this area that is also dotted here. And Robert Storrs, the then governor of Jerusalem, thought that it would be a great idea to also kind of bring him on board, since Giddis was already there and had already been paid by the Zionist Federation, to come on board and plan for the city's future. And years after, we see that his plan was the plan that actually got basically implemented. And hence, when we go back to these photographs that I was showing you of the buildings around the city and what's happening today, or what happened over the last 50 years or so, and the disparity between East and West Jerusalem goes back to these times. To me, all of this became clear when I was using these photographs more as a source of information, and by looking at the details in every photograph and not using them as mementos of this lost past glorious history that we all so kind of yearn for, but hence is now long gone. But kind of use it more as tools for learning about what is happening and understanding the whole power dynamics that have created what we're in for today. Jumping real quickly to the Via Dolorosa project, which I was so privileged to be asked by Joe to work on. This project had already started. I already started working on the Holy Sepulchre during the pandemic, was in 2020. And I actually wanted to document the Holy Sepulchre when there was no tourists. And that's very important for anybody who visits the Holy Sepulchre in any time apart from the period of the pandemic. It is also almost impossible to see anything inside the church, because it's always crowded with tourists and visitors, and you can never appreciate the details, the beauty of it. And so that's what I embarked upon. And so when Joe asked me to do the Via Dolorosa, I thought, wow, this is actually perfect. Just to kind of, yeah, Joe showed these photographs. I'm going to show them real quick now and say a few words. As you can imagine, when one is trying to reshoot some of these photographs that were taken 100, 150 years ago, the angle, the location, the camera itself, the lenses are completely different. So for this particular location, it was impossible to take this photograph because there were two buildings that were built on that site. The one here you can see on the left, and the one partly showing here on the right. So that angle I could never achieve. And hence the whole project of documenting the Via Dolorosa project was not to be very precise about, you know, the angles and the framing, and not to try to juxtapose the old with the new and see the difference, but to kind of take a very kind of more broader view of the whole place and what happened to those locations. And hence you see that this building here, the whole top second floor was taken down, and the building here was completely redone, and yeah, a different building was erected. Again here, you can see that the northern side along this street, which is the Via Dolorosa street, was basically a ruin, and maybe Dr. Gibson can speak more about it. And my research and coming to realize how many buildings, like you see the one here on the left-hand side, and the continuation of all the Christian churches that mark the second and second station and the site of flagellation. Right at the top of the street, there's Saint Anne. All of this was actually land that was bought or gifted, and all these churches were built along this road. Again, this, you see the buildings here on the right, on the site that was practically before 1850 a site of ruin, or there was hardly any buildings at the site on that side of the city before 1850. Joe spoke about these buildings. Like here, again, you see on the left, the site of the Austrian hospice. I've seen a drawing, not a photograph, of the site, which was basically a hell. Nothing there. The fourth station, which just right on the left-hand side. Fifth station. Sixth station. Seventh station. You can see some of these photographs I took during the pandemic, where there was actually no one in the street. So that was a very special time to do these photographs. I didn't manage to do everything. I had only captured few of the photographs of the Bonfils, but when I came to do this in 2022, was, yeah, completely different, and already there were tourists and people in the streets, and wasn't very as easy as it was during the pandemic. What's interesting about this is that Joe mentioned that these are guards. I think, yeah, they might be guards, but they don't look like guards. I think they are part of the families who guarded the gate, who actually were charging fees for people who would enter, you see. So they're either members of the Nesebe or the other family. I forgot what the name of the other family. And according to Hintelian, which I think Professor Gibson will speak more about, these guys were the reason that the ladder on the facade of the Holy Sepulchre, on the window on the top, were the reason for this ladder, where the Armenians would access that platform and draw up food without passing through the gate and having to pay fees for these guards at the gate of the Holy Sepulchre. Now it doesn't exist anymore. Joe mentioned these. what I loved about this is how the renovation was done with the mosaics on the ceiling. Very, very beautiful. It's very impressive nowadays. The edicule, I mean, it's such a magnificent site now, because they've removed the scaffolding that was there for many, many years. Professor Gibson will speak, I think, much more about that. Again, the edicule inside the this photograph, and I did many inside the tomb. These are not possible today, and this was only possible during the pandemic. Chapel of St. Helena, Joseph spoke about it, and then a very general view from the Mosque of Omar, which is opposite the Holy Sepulchre, from the minaret of the Mosque of Omar. I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome. I want to express my thanks to the organizers of this very special event and to the two previous speakers. I'm actually going to be taking you back 2,000 years or so. Let me just share my screen with you so you can see the first slide of my presentation. In fact, I will be talking about the Via Dolorosa in terms of its original location, as we understand it from historical and archaeological sources. So let's start. As you've already understood from the previous speakers, this is a very special city. And as you can see here from this aerial view, which sort of focuses on the Temple Mount, which is a place where you could see the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque to the south. The city itself sort of has, as Jack mentioned, developed in different directions. But I'm not going to be talking about the 19th or the early 20th century, but take you back to the Roman period, to the time of Jesus. And the idea that I'd like to express here is to investigate aspects relating to the movements of Jesus as we perceive him to be an historical figure within Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. And of course, all of this depends on an enormous amount of understanding of the archaeological data on the one hand, and interpretation of the texts. As you can see here, I've put in a quotation from Luke 13:34, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills prophets and stones those who are sent to it. So Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, in Bethany, comes into Jerusalem, and based especially on the Gospel of John, spends a lot of time at two locations. The Bethesda Pool, on the one hand to the north, the area of the Church of St. Anne, and the Siloam Pool to the south, and of course in the arena of the Temple Mount. And then during those final days, he's then taken to trial on the opposite western side of Jerusalem of that period, and then taken to the place of crucifixion. This, of course, is very important in order to understand the Via Dolorosa. So, as I mentioned beforehand, the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, as it's known today, was the focal point for Jesus when arriving in Jerusalem. And I'm not going to go into any details simply because time is limited, and I want to arrive at the point where we can discuss those aspects relating to the trial of Jesus and the place of burial. So here you can see on the right an aerial view looking at the Temple Mount from the south. In the center, you can see the gray dome of the Aqsa Mosque. And then behind the Dome of the Rock, which marks the most likely place of the Jewish temple that existed 2,000 years ago. On the left, you can see a map which is based on topographical work done mainly by late 19th century explorers, such as Charles Wilson and Charles Warren. And what I've done is I've superimposed on this topographical map, which shows right at the center here, you can see where it says temple area, you can see an outline of the Dome of the Rock here. Those features that might have existed 2,000 years ago. Of course, as Jack showed quite well, changes take place even within a relatively short period of time, from the 19th century all the way through to the 20th century. Of course, archaeologically, major changes can take place. And so what you see in red is probably what existed 2,000 years ago. If we move on, I'll just emphasize that there are all sorts of different kinds of sources that we might rely upon. Together with my colleague David Jacobson, I produced in 1996, quite a while ago, a source book on all of the cisterns, subterranean chambers and conduits of the Haram al-Sharif based on archival sources. And archives, as you can imagine from the previous two talks that you've been listening to, archives can be an amazing source of data. Look at that photograph at the lower left of the screen, which shows this underground passage, which leads from the south of the Temple Mount area under the Haram al-Sharif. Now, excavations have taken place especially by Israelis in and around the Temple Mount area, which has brought to light a whole set of different features, which, as you can see in this picture, here you can see a street which runs from the southwest corner of the Temple Mount area and is covered by this enormous pile of stones. So using some of that data, which comes out from excavations, together with the historical sources, one can get a sort of picture of what the temple area might have looked like in this model, which was created by Lane Rittmer, what the Temple Mount might have looked like at the time of Jesus. However, recent work is showing that it's much more complicated than that, that the Temple Mount that was conceived by Herod the Great when he entered into Jerusalem in 37 BC and then started the preparations for the rebuilding of the temple itself and the creating of the Temple Mount. This is a building program which lasted well beyond his life. He died in 4 BCE. In fact, in the years that preceded the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple in the year 70, building works had still probably not been totally completed. So when we're trying to understand the context of Jesus in Jerusalem, one has to take into account some of the building works and whether they existed. I, for instance, had proposed in the book that Carla very graciously mentioned that I'd written, that this may have been the scene for the place where the money changers were, and of course that important passage which is in the Gospel of John, which relates to the Jesus overturning the tables. But of course, nowadays it looks like this royal stoa, as it's referred to by Josephus Flavius, may not have been built at the time that Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, or at least it was under construction. So we need to reassess things as we go along as archaeologists, thinking about the different locations in Jerusalem, such as the Siloam Pool, which was situated to the south, and the Bethesda Pool to the north. I'm particularly interested in the Bethesda Pool area having been very graciously given access by the White Fathers to investigate the ruins at that location. But that, of course, is a subject for another lecture. When we're trying to understand where and how Jesus would have been situated in terms of the Last Supper, this is much more sort of complex. There are different kinds of buildings that exist in Jerusalem, some of them quite palatial, as you can see from the lower right-hand corner of this screen, which is a reconstruction of one of the mansions which have been uncovered in the Jewish quarter. I bring this image of a mosaic floor showing a kind of sort of Last Supper, a supper, let's put it that way, taking place, but that comes from Sepphoris. But it's just to illustrate what that might have looked like. On the left, you see this map which I created based on all of the archaeological remains that exist at this point in time, showing what Jerusalem might have looked like circa 30 CE, which is when Jesus would have arrived in Jerusalem. Now I turn to the various archaeological excavations that took place within Armenian territory in Jerusalem. And I have to say I'm very grateful both to the Jerusalem Patriarch himself and to those who work with him for being so gracious and allowing me to undertake the study of a lot of the remains which exist in and around the traditional Mount Zion of today and within the Armenian Quarter. So here you can see the Israeli archaeological excavations that took place with Armenian support, financial and otherwise, in the early 1970s. These excavations were never published, and they've been granted to me for publication. As you can see, there's a plot over here on the right that comes from that site. It dates from the Umayyad period. So here you can see the traditional House of Caiaphas, or St. Saviour's, which is on Mount Zion. And on behalf of my University of North Carolina, Charlotte, I have been conducting renewed excavations within this open area with an outreach program to local residents, whether Jewish or Palestinian. And the idea is to try and study all the different facets in terms of the history of the area. This is on the slope of Mount Zion here. You can see where, while we don't know where the house of Caiaphas was situated, it gives us an understanding of what these mansions or these buildings might have looked like when Jesus was brought before Caiaphas. You can see a Jewish ritual pool, and then next to it was a bath. Actually, I have to say, I lay down in that bath on the left to see whether it will be suitable. It's actually deeper than the bath that I have in my flat. And on the right, you can see a place where one could sit and disrobe before getting into the bath. And nearby there's a bakery and some nice finds, of course, the gold coin here of Nero, a stone bowl, and an interesting 10-line inscription. This is from which was found in the rubble of a building that dates back to the year 70. So it was destroyed by Titus and the Roman legionnaires who attacked the upper city of Jerusalem and just south of the Armenian Quarter of today. And there's an inscription on it. So this is quite important. It is quite cryptic in parts, but there's one part which can be read, and it seems to imply a return to the house of Yah. Presumably Yah is God, so there's a reference here to a person going to the house of God. So this is all very exciting. Now, of course, one comes to the actual trial of Jesus. Where did it take place? And although the traditional place is placed at the rock of Antonia, which is on the north-east side of the city, I would say that probably 99% of all historians and archaeologists accept that it took place within the Roman Praetorium, which is actually on the south west side of the city, in the area of the Armenian Quarter of today. So here you can see in this photograph, you can see the western city wall, the citadel on the left, and that very ugly, I have to agree with Jack, that very ugly edifice with those columns, with that freeway, as he calls it, crossing over it just outside of Jaffa Gate. But the point I want to make here is you can see the Mount Zion over here, the Armenian Quarter. This is where the Roman Praetorium was situated. It was the old palace of Herod the Great, and it was renewed and reused by the Roman governors, including Pontius Pilate, in the first century. So here, this is the place where Jesus was brought after having been in the Caiaphas house in front of the priest there. And here you can see next to the Western Wall, you can see the excavations that took place there, and you can see the remains of this gateway. You can see this double wall with these steps which lead up. So this is probably, if one's looking for an location in Jerusalem that Jesus himself might have stood on, if you're looking at the sort of historicity of things, this is the place. You can actually see here a blocked doorway, or gate, which led into the Praetorium. Whether it was here exactly or whether inside the wall, one can't know for certain. But the Gospel of John actually does provide us with information. You can see a reconstruction of what that gateway to the Praetorium would have looked like. And the Roman governor ostensibly would not have had a trial taking place within the apartments or the buildings of the Praetorium. It would have been at a secure location in front of it. And this was the gate, which existed there in front of the Praetorium. You can see the reconstruction, two alternatives here. Double gates. You can see that within this area, a trial could take place. Indeed, we're also told by Josephus Flavius that 30 years afterwards, and 60 or 30 odd years afterwards, in around 66 CE, another trial took place in front of the Praetorium, and it does seem to reference a gate. So if we take the information from John 18:19, the tribunal was set out outside the Praetorium. Jesus was brought from a prison from within the Praetorium. It took place, according to John 19:13, at an elevated location called Gabata, which is actually Aramaic, which indicates kind of rocky outcrop or something like that, and that there was a pavement, the stratus nearby. So if we combine that with archaeological evidence, it does seem to indicate that this is the location, or it is a feasible location, and it's based on good archaeological and historical data. So then that leads us to the question, where was the original Via Dolorosa? If this is the place of the tribunal, and you have Golgotha situated beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that would mean that either Jesus was led outside the city wall, seen here in red, to the area of the Jaffa Gate of today. Of course, that was on the northwest side of the city, and then to Golgotha. Or alternatively, he would be taken inside the Praetorium and then led through a major street on the side of the Praetorium, roughly equivalent to the Armenian street of today, which runs through the Armenian Quarter. I think many people wouldn't realize, walking down the Armenian Quarter Road, that actually is probably the Via Dolorosa for 2,000 years ago. So this is quite interesting. Moving ahead, we don't really know very much about crucifixion at that time. However, there is evidence of crucifixion, which was found in a Jewish tomb on the north side of Jerusalem. You can see the original photograph I'm showing you on the left, and a reconstruction. And it's been sort of studied by different people. Here you can see Professor Hershkovitz examining digital view of it. How was the crucifixion undertaken? A lot of discussion, and together with colleagues, we've been investigating their sort of possibilities. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but that brings me to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. and you've heard two wonderful presentations explaining about different aspects. And you can see Jack did mention this very famous little ladder right at the top there, just below the window, which according to the status quo cannot ever be moved. So I'm interested in historical, excuse me, historical, excuse me, historical photography as well. And there are one or two photographs where it is missing. One wonders why. But the facade that you're looking at is from the Crusader period. The question is, what did the original tomb of Jesus look like? Together with a colleague, I wrote a book many, many years ago. I think it was published in 1994 with Joan Taylor. We published all of the archaeological evidences that had existed up to then. However, as you know, the Armenian Patriarchate, together with the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate and the Franciscan Patriarchate, got together and they agreed upon a program of releasing the edicule, or that structure which is around the tomb of Jesus, from its scaffold. This is the very ugly kind of sort of scaffolding which was put up in the Mandate period as a result of the situation where the edicule had suffered from a major fire and other sort of aspects, which meant that it had to be sort of kept in place with that scaffolding. That scaffolding has now been removed. The edicule has been restored. And I was allowed to see the documentation, and I've read all the publications that have been produced by the engineers and others to try and understand what was found archaeologically. And if you look at the top left, you can see this is the culmination of this joint project between the Armenian Patriarchate, specifically, and the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. And you can see that's the chapel of angels. The purple gray represents the structure of the edicule itself, looking here towards the tomb itself, which is slightly askew in terms of its position. And what you see here in gray with dotted lines represent the scanning which was done on either side of the tomb chamber by all these engineers and technicians. What I've done is I've compiled it all together, put it all together from all these different maps and drawings and everything. And you can see that clearly it had been substantially destroyed, probably by Caiaphas Hakim. But what's interesting is also that they removed in this project, which is undertaken with the support of National Geographic, coming across under the marble remnants of the rock bench as well. So we've got the rock bench here, and we've got partial remains of the walls of the tomb on the north and south. This is quite important. Of course, to the left or to the west of the edicule is a tomb, which is traditionally associated with Joseph of Arimathea. And based on all of this information, I think it's quite clear that there was a cemetery area there in the first century. So the location of this as the tomb of Jesus, as a tomb which existed in the first century, can be definitely authenticated. On the lower right, I've produced a kind of sort of drawing which shows what that tomb might have looked like, based on the archaeological evidences and the topographical information. In my book of 1994, together with Joan Taylor, we tried to reconstruct the underlying topography. And there's more research which has been done by different scholars in recent years on topographical issues as well. So when it comes to understanding the place of the tomb, I think that we're in the possession of a lot of data, together with that information as to the underlying topography, rock topography of the area beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, from all sorts of excavations and from archival sources. And it allows us to understand more perfectly what that the tomb of Jesus might have looked like when Jesus was brought there for burial. And I just end here with this image here of a body wrapped in a shroud brought to one such tomb. This was a kind of sort of recreation for a television documentary that I participated in. But what's interesting is there's a reference here to the linen wrappings, and that there was a separate wrapping for the head itself, as we understand from the Gospel of John. And I undertook an archaeological excavation of a tomb in the area of Akeldama, the field of blood, finding there remains of a human being wrapped in a shroud, which could be dated to circa 50 CE, so roughly from the time of Jesus. And it turned out that that person, owing to our DNA analysis, suffered from leprosy, Hansen's disease. So it's really quite interesting. So our knowledge concerning the movements of Jerusalem are quite extensive nowadays as a result of archaeology and re-understanding of historical sources. And the Via Dolorosa, it appears, did begin in the Armenian Quarter of today and ran towards the north and northeast, towards the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of today, the Golgotha of then, which was outside the city. It appears that the Via Dolorosa that you heard about in the two previous presentations is something which occurs in terms of the understanding of the layout of the Via Dolorosa in the Crusader period or later. And that is as a result of the 1099 capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders. Jerusalem was emptied of all of its inhabitants. And that meant that the Crusaders could reimagine the city of Jerusalem. And that changed the position of the Via Dolorosa to the place where it is today. However, I would just end by saying that while historians and archaeologists they really like to know exactly where things took place, as a friend of mine who's deeply religious once pointed out to me, Jerusalem is, after all, the landscape of where these things took place. So when the religious person walks along the Via Dolorosa of today, the historical aspects to it are less important. It's more to do with the way that person feels and their convictions relating to their understanding of the Gospels and of Jesus in Jerusalem. So on that point, I would like to thank you, and just to end with this view of Jerusalem. And as Carla mentioned, my book on Jesus in Jerusalem based on archaeological sources. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Dr. Gibson. And thank you also to Jack Persekian and to Dr. Joseph Malikian. All fascinating. You've all raised so many interesting questions and issues. Of course, Dr. Gibson, you are absolutely right. We don't have to be obsessed with the precise history, but I think you have created the possibility that we might have another photo exhibition on the alternate Via Dolorosa, which you suggested might occur. And that does raise an interesting question of, what does that look like? And could we reconstruct that in some way too? If not to reconstruct it photographically, just to visit it as interested students of archaeology and history. So I think we might have some questions from our audience. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to actually ask either Joe or Jack if you had any immediate reactions to Dr. Gibson's presentation, because I think your feedback is just as important as mine would be. Go ahead, either one of you.
I just want to say that it needs to be, it needs to be clear that the stations are things that were created with time. And especially as Dr. Gibson said, after the Crusader period. So the whole story about Jesus falling first time and the second time and the third time and what have you, I mean, these are stories that you cannot find in the Bible or any of the writings of the day, but you can only see it coming out again, as Dr. Gibson had mentioned, from the angle of trying to make people kind of tangibly connect to the place. So yeah, there is a location here. You can see it, you can touch it, you can, as they do today, and that would connect you physically and of course spiritually to the place and to the whole story of the Via Dolorosa.
And Joe, do you have any comments?
No, that's that's fine. What Jack said was right on target.
Right. Now, we did have a question from one of our viewers. Are these photos available to view? They are available if you go to armenianimage.org, and all of the photos, with the exception of Dr. Gibson's presentation, are available with the map, and you can look at them there. Anne, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers. This was just a fascinating series of lectures and images that have provoked a number of questions, at least in my mind, and I'm sure in many of our viewers. So once again, if you have a question in our audience, please feel free to pose it in the Q&A box. Let me just ask a very quick question of Shimon. The Chapel of the Angels and the evidence for the location of the burial tomb of Jesus, or at least that owned by Joseph of Arimathea, you indicated was quite a ways underground. But of course, at the time of Jesus's crucifixion and burial, the Gospels seem to indicate the tomb would have been above ground. Perhaps as an archaeologist, you could comment on that sort of temporal evolution to be in this same geographical location, but significantly underground?
Well, thank you for that question. The underground area of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a very interesting one. And I have to say that I'm very grateful to the Armenian community that allowed me to investigate the area behind the Chapel of St. Helena a long time ago. And what's interesting is the entire area beneath the church was a vast stone quarry. And the stone quarry began, apparently, based on the archaeological evidences, already in the 8th century BCE. So it's a long time before the time of Jesus, which means that parts of the quarry were probably abandoned and used for gardens on the one hand, which fits in with the evidence that we have from the Gospel of John, that there was a garden at the place of the tomb, and that some parts of the stone quarry were used for cutting out rock-cut tombs. So although it was underground, it was still above ground to a certain extent, because you had all of these almost like step-like rock scarps extending up the hill. So you would see the facade of the tomb in front of you. And what's interesting is that the tomb, the so-called tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, is very close to the edicule of today. And when you disconnect all of the overlying structural remains, which date from the time of Constantine the Great, 4th century, and all the way up to the present day, you can visualize the underlying topography. It really gives you a sort of sense of what that location would have looked like outside the city walls, so that at the time of Jesus, Jesus would have been led outside the city into this vast area, which was close to the major road leading out of Jerusalem. And there the crucifixion would have taken place. And immediately afterwards, his body would have then been taken for burial. may I just sort of say that the place of Golgotha was probably not the actual place of the crucifixion, but indicated the area of the crucifixion, almost like a signpost, because the rock itself, I investigated in the 1980s, it's so narrow. I mean, there's no space for the placing of any cross. So there are two possibilities. Either the rock itself has been totally modified in later periods, so the original hillock is not visible, or alternatively that the crucifixion took place in that immediate vicinity, but not exactly at that spot. But again, as I mentioned before, for a religious person, the fact that you can touch the rock of Golgotha is much more important than the exact location, which we, of course, want to seek out.
Great, thank you. And another somewhat quick question. I think this might be for Joe and Jack, or for Shimon. Both Joe and Jack did reference the 14th station as being, near the chapel of Saint Helena, but indicated that among Armenians, this chapel is known as the Chapel of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, who of course lived several hundred years after the time of the crucifixion. Perhaps one of you could comment on how that tradition evolved in terms of the naming, or if any of you are aware of that.
Well, I'm willing to jump in there, unless, of course, Joseph or Jack want to. But the chapel of Saint Helena, the foundations of the chapel itself, date back to Constantinian times. And then the archaeological excavations that were undertaken by the Armenian community in the 1970s, they exposed 3 sets of walls behind the Chapel of St. Helena today. The earliest date back to pre-Constantinian times, so apparently they're substructures dating from the time of Hadrian, when there was a Roman forum in that area. And then you have the walls of the Constantinian church, which are on both sides, lateral sides of the chapel. And then, of course, you have the later remains as well, or the later constructions of the stages. So the tradition relates to Helena, and that exists there is with the finding of the cross. But of course, Eusebius does not mention anything to do with the finding of the cross. So some historians have cast doubts on whether or not Helena actually found that cross at that time, or whether it's a slightly later tradition. It is quite complicated. In terms of St. Gregory, there are two altars there. One, of course, is to St. Helena. The other one is to the penitent thief, as you know. The floor itself of the Chapel of St. Helena was removed back in 1971, I believe, revealing under it quite an interesting set of rock-cut features here and there.
Very good, thank you. Okay, well, I think this brings us pretty much to the end of our Zoom webinar. So let me just thank once again our speakers, Dr. Joe Malikian, Mr. Jack Persekian, and Professor Shimon Gibson for a very thoughtful and stimulating set of lectures, the photo exhibits, and our discussion. And special thanks as well to my partner, Dr. Carla Garabedian, for coordinating this really excellent event with us. Now let me close by noting that, again, we have recorded this entire event, and it will be available on our Promise Armenian Institute YouTube channel. So please feel free to visit that or the Armenian Image Archive to see many of these specific images that you've observed during the webinar. And again, to note for you that in the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA, we have a number of events planned for the not too distant future. So please Be sure to visit our website as well as social media to see more information on our upcoming programming. So finally, before closing this last event of our academic year, I'd also like to offer my special thanks to our amazing Promise Armenian Institute Deputy Director, Hasmik Baltasarian, who has worked so energetically and effectively in coordinating all aspects of this event and all of our other events throughout the year. So thank you, Hasmik, and thanks once again to all of you for your attendance at this webinar. And we look forward to having you participate in future events for the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA. Thank you and have a great rest.